So we have been looking at the 18th century, and and we have been looking at developments in Ukrainian lands in the Russian Empire. We saw just how Russia, or the Russian Empire, Tsarist Russia, Imperial Russia, between the 1760s and 1780s, eliminated the governmental, the administrative specificities of territories on the fringes of the entire realm of the Russian Empire. In the case of Ukrainian lands, we saw that first in Sloboda, Ukraine in the 1760s, in Zaporozhye 1770s, the Hetmanate in the 1780s, as well as the Crimean and the southern lands here along the Black Sea in the 1780s. And how then the end of any kind of autonomy on Ukrainian lands was culminated. So too, aside from administrative structure of Ukrainian lands ending autonomy, did the Russian imperial rulers also succeed in integrating the social structure and the economic life of these lands with the rest of the empire. And that is what we are going to look at today, this process of socioeconomic change. As with administrative change, it wasn't a quick process. It wasn't an immediate process. It was definitely gradual. And in that sense, the 18th century continued essentially trends that had begun already during the previous century. When we're looking at the social structure of Ukraine, the various social estates, remember social estates are not classes, social estates in the 18th century, for all intents and purposes, remained the same as they were in the 17th century. The first thing we want to look at is how during the 18th century we have an increasing differentiation among the Cossacks. And as you see on this chart that I just handed out, we have the Cossacks divided in the most simplest terms into the distinguished military fellows, the starshina, the elite, on the one hand, and the rank and file Cossacks on the other. There were, by the 1760s, on the one hand, about 300 members of the old Rus Orthodox aristocracy. They're within the realm of the nobility, because they just continued. They were aristocrats, recognized. There were about 300 of them. And then 2,100 members of this, what we can call the new Cossack gentry, that is this Cossack elite, the starshina, the officers indicated here as the distinguished military fellows. Now this Cossack elite, the distinguished military fellows within the structure of the hetmanate in particular, the main administrative and successor to this Cossack state that Khmelnytsky created back in the mid-17th century. These Cossacks, these distinguished military fellows, very anxious to improve, one might say, enhance their status. They even began to call themselves by the name given to the former hated Polish nobility, the Szlachta. So that's how they felt, that they were already in that social stratum. But important to note that the Tsarist Russian government was not yet ready to recognize the Cossack gentry as part of the Russian Empire's noble aristocratic estate. So that did not yet happen, but clearly this was the desire of the Cossack elite. As for the peasants, whether they were estate peasants or proprietary serfs, their status also changed, gradually, in effect, worsened during the course of the 18th century. In fact, the 18th century saw an absolute increase in the number of proprietary peasants, whether they lived on the lands of the secular nobility or on church-owned landed estates. And there was also both a quantitative as well as a qualitative increase in the number and the kind of duties that the certainly proprietary peasants were expected to perform. By the 18th century, 2 days a week of service exclusively to the landlord, again, whether the secular landlord or the church landlord, had become the very minimum, and in some cases more. As for the two other social estates on this list, the clergy and the townspeople, the status of each of those, as before, differed radically. As for the clergy, it was able to increase its wealth as well as its social prestige within Cossack society. As members of a state church, the Orthodox hierarchy and the monastic orders were eager and willing to cooperate with the secular authorities in order to preserve their social and economic status. And so by the mid-18th century, as an example, the monasteries alone, the Orthodox monasteries alone, owned 10,000 landed estates. Actually, 17% of the land in the hetmanate belonged to the Orthodox Church. Very important, all clergy were exempt from taxes. And because they could marry, this is the Orthodox world, the Eastern Christian world, well, they could be married, much of their amassed wealth was often passed on to their children. So we had a kind of semi-hereditary social estate here. As for the townspeople, they were, or this social stratum was in great contrast to that of the clergy. The vast majority of the townspeople, the artisans and the workers, remained in the same dependent situation during our 18th century as had been the case during the previous 17th century. And that was because the Cossack administration continued to extract as much profit from urban areas as possible, and in many ways the Cossack administration owned the cities. There were few cities that had self-rule under so-called Magdeburg law, which was typical of the rest of European society. We had, quote-unquote, Magdeburg cities in Ukrainian lands, but they were limited in number, and very often those cities with self-rule were very small in size. The point of all of this is that the leading positions in Ukrainian towns within the Russian Empire were really in the hands of a small group of wealthy urban dwellers, we call them patricians, the Cossacks themselves, that is, members of the Distinguished Military Fellows, and also foreign merchants. A few words now about economic developments. Agriculture, one shouldn't be surprised, continued to be the main economic activity on Ukrainian territories throughout the 18th century. These same decades also witnessed, at least in Ukrainian lands within the Russian Empire, the growth of a small but vibrant domestic industry. This was the beginnings of it. And also a continuation whereby trade from Ukrainian lands with Poland and the Ottoman Empire was on the decrease, continued to be on the decrease, replaced by greater integration within the Russian Empire's economic framework. This is reflected in international trade and commerce after the Khmelnytsky uprising in the mid-17th century, the Polish orientation in Cossack Ukrainian trade. After all, Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was weakened, and instead trade between Cossack Ukraine and Muscovy to the north, as well as the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate, increased after the Khmelnytsky uprising. Not surprisingly, Khmelnytsky and the Cossacks at that time totally opposed to Polish rule, and that was reflected in trade. Again, as usual, raw products from Ukraine, wax, honey, hides, etc., in return for finished products from either Muscovy and certainly from the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. Under the dynamic Peter I, Tsar Peter I, that begins our 18th century, he was anxious, as he was reforming everything in the empire, or trying to, the empire and the Tsardom, trying to change it, he was anxious to strengthen Muscovy, later the Russian Empire, by integrating its economy and all under the control of the central government in St. Petersburg, the new capital that he created. Now, from the Russian imperial standpoint, all Cossack territories, it didn't make a difference whether they were in the Hetmanate or in Zaporozhye to the south or the Sloboda Ukraine in the northeast, were from the standpoint of the center part of the one imperial Russian realm. And therefore, they should be economically as well as politically integrated within the Russian imperial system. And so this is what took place. Under Peter I, several decrees were passed forbidding merchants from Ukraine to be selling to other countries outside the Russian Empire, and it became quite effective. The point of all of this, briefly, to sum up, in the course of the 18th century, the economy of Ukrainian lands within the Russian Empire left Bank Ukraine. The economy, just like its political and social structure, which we looked at, the political structure we looked at last time, I've just mentioned something about the social structure, became progressively isolated from that of the rest of Europe and integrated into the framework of the Russian Empire. So much for socio and economic factors. What I would like to look at now are some matters dealing with culture, cultural matters. And I will begin now so I don't have to break up by passing out 4 sets of illustrations. I would ask if the two of you share one of them and then give the other two to your colleagues. I'll point these out in the course of our discussion. Now, while in the realm of political and socioeconomic life, the 18th century characterized by increasing integration of Ukrainian lands within the Russian Empire, we've just seen that. With regard to culture, the region, that is Ukrainian lands, continued to be a fertile ground through which the most contemporary developments in education, art, architecture, and literature from Western Europe reached Moscow. What's the difference between Western Europe here and Muscovy? Well, Ukraine functioned as a kind of conduit for Western culture. After all, it had been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And the cultural artifacts, intellectual ideas, etc., as we're going to see, even architectural styles, reached the Russian Empire from Poland, drawing its models from the rest of Europe, in particular Renaissance and post-Renaissance Italy. This process had already begun through Ukraine in the 17th century and was simply continued, or one might say accelerated, during the 18th century. Now, most of the cultural developments in 18th century Ukraine, continuing as before, were expressed in a religious context. Always the role of religion being very important in the East Slavic world. The Orthodox Church itself, like other institutions on Ukrainian lands, became more and more integrated into the Russian Empire. And in the process of becoming part of the Russian, Muscovite, and then Russian imperial system, the juridical autonomy, self-rule, and eventually wealth of the Orthodox Church was sharply reduced. Now, the process of church integration is related to the year 1686. By the way, this year became very important within the last 10 years in Ukraine, but for reasons that most people didn't understand. Ever since Christianity was brought to Kyiv and Rus, as we saw in the late 10th century, the 900s, by the Kievan ruler, Grand Prince, and later Saint Volodymyr, the Orthodox in Ukraine were under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, who was the highest church prelate in the world of Orthodox Christianity. But in 1686, as a result of political factors connected with relations between Muscovy and the Ottoman Empire, because the Ecumenical Patriarch was a powerful figure when it was the East Roman Empire. But after 1453, he's subordinate, he lives within the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic state. And at this time, mid-1680s, Muscovy and Ottoman Empire, or Muscovy was the stronger party here, and influenced the Ecumenical Patriarch through the Ottoman Sultan, so that after 1686, all of the Orthodox eparchies, that is dioceses, on present-day Ukrainian and also Belarusian lands, the former eastern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, now they were jurisdictionally moved or placed under the authority of the Russian Orthodox Church of Moscow, the so-called Moscow Patriarchate. This church in Ukraine initially retained many of its traditional privileges, and then even at the end of within the decade after that, during the tenure of Hetman Mazepa, the church even entered a new period of expansion and wealth. But then we know what happened to Mazepa, and after Mazepa fell from favor with the Tsar, Peter I, the status of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine experienced greater integration into the Russian Orthodox Church. Then also, by the way, in 1721, as part of Peter I's wide-ranging reforms, he was changing everything in the empire as a whole, including in the Orthodox Church. He simply abolished the position of the Patriarch, the highest office in the Orthodox Church, because he wanted religion to be treated in the same way as every other aspect of the new Russian imperial social structure, and therefore abolished the Patriarch and created a kind of ministry, just like any other ministry. But for the church, it was called the Holy Synod. That is, this ministry was made up of bishops of the Orthodox Church as well as secular leaders. And in fact, the head of it, the kind of minister of this Holy Synod religious ministry, was always a secular person. And as part of this, so there was no longer any patriarch, there was just the Holy Synod, Church of the Orthodox Holy Synod. And as part of this ecclesiastical reorganization, one of the offices, the Metropolitan of Kyiv, was no longer to be chosen through election, which was the traditional manner of doing this in the Orthodox world, election by local councils. Rather, the Metropolitan was to be appointed by the Tsar from candidates that were proposed by his department, this Holy Synod. Now, the following should be kept in mind. Ukrainian clergy, or clergy in Ukraine, were not particularly opposed to these changes. In fact, they actually the ones that were carrying them out. For instance, the first president of the Holy Synod, a man named Stepan Yavorsky, the first two vice presidents of the Holy Synod, Yanovsky, Prokopovich, all were natives of Ukraine, where they had previously played dominant roles in the religious and the cultural life of Kyiv. During the following decades, the status of Orthodoxy in Ukraine brought further in line with practices elsewhere in the Russian Empire. For example, in the 1770s, the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church took over the right of appointing archimandrites to monasteries throughout Ukraine. And then in the 1780s, all monastic property was secularized. 42 of the existing 61 monasteries and convents were closed. And so by the end of the 18th century, the government had fully integrated the Orthodox Church into the ecclesiastical structure of the Russian Empire as a whole. And why was this 1686 so important within the last 10 years? Is because an attempt succeeded Orthodox Church of Ukraine, separate from the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarch, was concluded within the last 10 years of the 21st century at the initiative of the Ecumenical Patriarch today, who simply abolished this decree in 1686, saying that it was done under political pressure. And so he took back the Orthodox of Ukraine under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarch, as it had been before, and then within 2 months granted it separate status as an autocephalous, jurisdictionally independent Orthodox Church in Ukraine. That was the actual procedure, and it was related to this date that I've just spoken about. As for education, schools on Ukrainian territory, here again the church continued to play a leading role. Most of the schools were operated by the Orthodox Church. Usually the sexton of the church or the cantor was the teacher, sometimes the wife of the priest. It's interesting to note also that compared to neighboring Muscovy and Poland, there were more elementary schools per number of inhabitants than either in Poland or in Muscovy on Ukrainian territory. So it was a pretty high level, given the circumstances of the 18th century. At the secondary level, the most important school, as had been in the previous century, was the Kievan Collegium, established by Metropolitan Petro Mohyla way back in the 1630s, and then transformed into an academy in 1701, the very beginning of the 18th century. And so by the 18th century, this Kievan Academy provided a 12-year program in philosophy and theology, modern languages, as well as classical languages. This Kievan Academy was the oldest and therefore the most influential center of higher learning in the 18th century Russian Empire. There were no higher schools in Muscovy, only in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And in fact, most of the leading hierarchs and intellectuals of this entire period in Muscovy and the Russian Empire, also very important political figures, Hetman Mazepa himself, and Orlyk, his successor, Catherine II's chancellor, a man named Alexander Bezborodko, the secular philosopher, a very important figure named Hryhorii Skovoroda. All of them were graduates of the Kievan Academy, and some of them taught there as well after graduating. And in fact, it was largely through graduates of the Kievan Academy who later moved north that the late 17th and first half of the 18th centuries, if you study Russian intellectual history, this era is known as the Ukrainian era of Russian intellectual history, because all of the leading lights of the time educated in the Kievan Collegium and then Academy. Should add that the Kievan Academy was only one of the schools of higher learning. There were other secondary schools or theological seminaries in Chernihiv, in Pereyaslav, in Poltava, Novhorod-Siversky. Particularly important was the Collegium, Orthodox Collegium in Kharkiv, in the Skovoroda, Ukraine. It began in 1726 as a seminary, then transformed into a collegium with secular students as well. And in fact, the Kharkiv Collegium was second only to the Kyiv Mohyla Academy in terms of the quality of its educational programs. Interesting footnote here. In Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Rite Christianity in general, musical instruments are banned. The argument being is that one should only give praise to the Lord through the instrument of the Lord, the human being and the human voice, and not some artificial instrument. As a result, the human voice took on special importance, And we now need to ensure a steady supply of vocal musicians. And so the Kievan Academy and various theological seminaries provided extensive programs in choral singing and a special school to train singers for the imperial court established in 1738 in the hetman's capital of Hryhorii, up in the northern part of the hetmanate, right near the rest of Muscovy, Russia proper. And this musical environment did indeed have an impact, so that three of the Russian Empire's greatest choral composers in the 18th century, and one can hear some of their music still today on classical radio stations, so-called Russian composers, were all from Ukraine. Maxim Berezovsky, a man named Bortniansky, and a third, Adam Vedel. The last two of them studied at the Kievan Mohyla Academy before moving to St. Petersburg to continue their careers. So again, another example of the transfer of culture from Ukraine to the north. This 18th century that we're looking at also witnessed the flourishing of Ukrainian architecture and painting and literature. The almost uninterrupted sequence of uprisings, civil war, foreign invasions that had marked the Khmelnytsky uprising in the middle of the 17th century, the period of ruin that followed it, only during the last decade of the 17th century, which coincided with the first decade of the tenure of Ivan Mazepa, there was some stability, and that stability had an impact on art, and in particular on architecture. And so, at least in the far western part of Ukraine, most especially in the Russian-ruled Hetmanate and Sloboda Ukraine, there was a period of peace and stability that was established, at least during that first decade of Mazepa, and then after the fall of Mazepa throughout the rest of the 18th century after 1711. And not surprisingly, this new era of peace in large parts of Ukraine also coincided with what has been described as the golden age of Ukrainian art. The golden age of Ukrainian art. In architecture, the flurry of reconstruction and new buildings during the period of Mazepa and subsequently came to be known as the Ukrainian or Cossack Baroque style, characterizing the first half of Mazepa's rule in the 1690s. It was now continued during the era of stability following the downfall of Mazepa. The Baroque models in church building, borrowing extensively from buildings where in Poland, Ukraine and Kyiv being the conduit of culture from the West through Poland. And now here they became ever larger in size, often topped with several gilded or azure domes. These new structures also had elaborate facades, typical of the Baroque period, half columns, incomplete pediments, heavily decorated interiors, very carefully brightened by the illusory use of light that was designed so it would pour in from certain corners of the interior of the church and just light up what was supposed to be lit. Now, despite the fact that these buildings were designed for Eastern Rite Christians and located within the borders of the Orthodox Russian Empire, actually they clearly looked Catholic in spirit, leading critics to often deride them as products of the Ukrainian Jesuit Baroque, Jesuits, of course, being the ultimate purveyors of Roman Catholic ideology. Ukraine had its own architects, and in fact, the most important of them was a man named Ivan Barsky. Ivan Barsky, best known for his structures built in the city of Kyiv, the Trinity Church of St. Cyril Monastery, the belfry of the Church of St. Constantine and Helena, and that is the first illustration that you have on your packet. Also, the second illustration that you have, the pavilion-like Samson's fountain, or the Felicial. Also, for Barsky's contribution, together with another architect, Andrei Kvasov, in the completion of the Church of the Nativity of the Virgin in a town called Kozelets, which is your third illustration. Quintessential Baroque. Quintessential Baroque. Notice the undulation, the movement of the very facade. Now, besides Baroque, other architectural trends prevalent in Western Europe at the time, neoclassicism and Rococo, also brought to Ukrainian lands by foreign architects, sometimes through Poland or directly from the rest of Europe, in particular Italy. In contrast to the movement and agitation of Baroque, we have the emotional restraint, greater simplicity of what is known as the neoclassical style, already becoming apparent in the main belfry, number 4 on your chart, the main belfry of the monastery of Kyiv. So if you look at this belfry and the previous illustration, it's like night and day. One is full of movement, the other is staid and controlled and ordered. Quintessential neoclassicism. Also, the reconstruction of the Kyiv Academy itself on illustration 5. You're looking at the side wing of it. Both, by the way, by a German architect named Johann Gottfried Schedel. So an example of foreign architects coming to Ukraine directly and working and building buildings. Now, on the other hand, we have the Rococo. Actually, it's a kind of offshoot of Baroque. And in that sense, it carried on the trend of elaborate decorative elements, but this time, much finer lines, creating a sense of lightness and delicacy. And of course, you'll look at number 6, this technique being employed in some of the structures designed already by the native architect Barsky, but in particular in the work of an Italian architect that Catherine II sent to Ukraine, a man named Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli. Rastrelli. He was actually the most outstanding purveyor of the Rococo style in architecture. And if any of you go to St. Petersburg, you see a quintessential 18th century town. Well, a lot of his architecture was done by this Rastrelli. Also brought the Rococo to Kyiv in the Imperial Mariinskyi Palace in Kyiv, and then again in this exquisite splash of gold and azure in the Church of St. Andrew in Kyiv. Now, the Baroque was even more prevalent in Western Ukrainian lands. We've been speaking about only Eastern Ukrainian lands then within Moscow. Our last lecture tomorrow will be on Western Ukrainian lands. And so I'll just mention here in terms of architecture, they, of course, were lands ruled by and in close proximity to the Roman Catholic cultural influence of Poland and neighboring Hungary, for that matter. And it is from this period that the proportionately massive, number 7 on your handout, Baroque St. George Cathedral in Lviv, also a city hall in Buchach, both by a German architect, Merdere Meretini, the Pochayev Monastery Church by another German architect, Gottfried Hoffmann, and in the very Italianate Dominican Church by Martin Urbanek. You can almost not tell whether you're in Italy or in Western Ukraine when we look at this Dominican church in Lviv. It's also from the farthest western edge of modern-day Ukrainian territory that a distinctly indigenous architecture arose, that of wooden churches. Now, to be sure, wood was always used for public and private structures. Going back to Kievan times, most of Kiev was, in fact, made out of wood. But in the Carpathian Mountain region of far western Ukraine, obviously wood was particularly abundant, so that the 18th century witnessed the construction of numerous wooden churches. These structures, though small in scale, still dot the landscapes of southern Galicia as well as Transcarpathia and even the Ruthenian inhabited area just across the border in northeastern Slovakia, 2 regions providing in a rustic setting quite elegant and subtle renditions of either the Gothic style or, for that matter, the Baroque style, but all in wood, as you see in the last of your illustrations, number 10. Not much to say about painting because of lack of time, though the styles were kind of a heavy Baroque, not dissimilar to portraiture in the lowlands, the Netherlands and Flanders. In the realm of literature, though, I do need to say something. Writings produced in the 18th century, typical of the Baroque era, with its wide variety of themes, stylistic complexities. In fact, style often became an end in itself, so that, as in the schools of the milieu of the Kievan Academy, form became more important than content. It should also be stressed here that the language used in literature and in other writings represented a highly stylized linguistic form, Church Slavonic, sometimes actually Latin, and in attempts to even write in Russian. The point, however, is that the opaqueness of these styles as well as language divorced totally from spoken Ukrainian vernacular, which contributed to the formalistic and, for that matter, not particularly vibrant qualities of most of the works of this period. Perhaps the most popular aspect of Ukrainian literary activity in this era was drama, a genre developed already during the 17th century under the influence of Polish and Latin plays, staged at the Brotherhood schools in Western Ukraine and then in the Kievan Collegium. The most widely produced plays, as one might expect from the environment in which they are being written and performed, were Christmas and Easter dramas, Lives of Saints, morality plays. There were also a few works of largely or exclusively secular nature, one about Volodymyr the Great, another one about Khmelnytsky, but they were the exception rather than the rule. The 18th century's most famous writer from Ukraine, this Hryhorii Skovoroda, Although he wrote numerous lyrical poems, he's best known both in Ukrainian lands and certainly in Russia. He was the part of this Ukrainian era in Russian intellectual development were his philosophical writings. Perhaps the only writers to depart from the purely religious motivations that characterized the 18th century comprised a group of what might be called Cossack intellectuals. Yes, there were Cossack intellectuals. As the exodus of creative architects, painters, writers, teachers, theologians primarily, as that exodus from Ukraine to Muscovy that began in the late 17th century, then continued and even increased as we've just seen in the 18th century. By the way, among the higher Russian church hierarchy alone, it was estimated that between 1700 and 1762, which is our period, as many as 70% were natives of either Ukraine or Belarus. And the places of this exodus, this, in a sense, brain drain to the north, all voluntarily, I might add, let's not forget that. Their places now were taken by Cossacks from the administration in the hetmanate, the starshina, the elite. These intellectual chancellorists, if you will, quite naturally most interested in the historical exploits of the social stratum that they claim to represent, the Cossacks. And so we have tales of the wars of Khmelnytsky being written and rewritten. These Cossack chroniclers, in that sense, were continuing in the tradition of their medieval forebears, going back to Kyiv and Rus, whose aim was to record events of a given epoch. Chroniclers. Beginning in the 1730s, however, there was a new kind of work that began to appear, one which traced the historical events in Ukraine, going back to the days of Kyiv and Rus, and then connecting them with the Cossack period, and therefore implicitly suggesting a sense of historic continuity. Ukrainian lands continuing Kyiv and Rus. This continuity, in a sense, provided justification for the maintenance of Cossack autonomy, which did exist for most of the 18th century, till the 1760s, 1780s. The first work of this kind actually appeared in the 1730s, and it was called, quote, Kratkaya Pisanie Malой России, a short description of Little Russia, published by a man named Vasil Ruban. This was only one. Several other historical treatises of this kind were written during the last decade of the autonomous existence of the hetmanate, which existed until the 1780s. They all argued in terms of historical and political precedents for the idea of Cossack distinctiveness. Now, to conclude, whereas these attempts to sustain autonomy, political autonomy for the hetmanate after the 1780s, we already saw last time, in the end that proved futile. The work of these Cossack chroniclers did set a stage for a basic change from an intellectual, conceptual environment where religious concerns that had been foremost in Ukrainian thought, now to one in which secular ideas and demands for the rights of the individual and for the people, the nation as a whole, this now began to be an element and eventually to dominate cultural life. Now, it's true to bring about fully this change in direction in Ukraine's intellectual evolution, a new mindset, a new ideology had to be introduced. That ideology did finally come in the form of nationalism. Their precepts, or the precepts of nationalism, however, that came to dominate Ukrainian developments throughout the 19th and most half of the 20th century is a story that is beyond this course unless you come back next semester. So we will stop here with our discussion now of Ukrainian lands in the Russian Empire. Our last lecture tomorrow morning will deal with Ukrainian lands, the remnants of them under Poland.